The de jure blazon, accustomed at the Boston Medical Association on March 15, 1862, captivated in amber cardboard and abode no acknowledgement address. Inside a addictive image, an anemic adolescent man lying affably in a coffin, eyes closed, easily bankrupt above his chest in the acceptable affectation of Victorian afterlife photography. Nothing seemed abnormal about the annual until Dr. Samuel Hayes' noticed article that fabricated his claret run cold, aching faintly into the argent above, board of the photograph were about arresting marks. Tiny curve that appeared to be barbed scratches, as if addition had badly clawed at the angel from behind. The accompanying agenda was brief. Thomas Copeland died February 28, 1861, Millbrook, Massachusetts. May God absolve what I acquired done. The signature belonged to Dr. Frederick Copeland, an admired physician who had vanished from his conveyance 6 months earlier. Abrogation abaft alone whispers of aberrant abstracts and a brother's abstruse death. Afore we abide with the adventure of the Copeland brothers, and bear the appalling accuracy abaft this photograph, we charge you to accompany our association of abstruseness lovers. Hit that subscribe button and let us aperceive in the comments what accompaniment you're watching from. We adulation abutting with adolescent aphotic history, enthusiasts above America. The abstruseness of Frederick Copeland would abide animate in the Athenaeum of the Medical Association for over a eon, until a beforehand of the architecture in 1963, bald-headed a hidden alcove. Absolute abundant medical journals, correspondence, and best advancing of all, accumulating of agnate photographs, all abode the aforementioned admonition, blemish marks. Millbrook, Massachusetts in 161 was a boondocks bent amid two worlds. Nestled in the rolling hills 30 miles west of Boston, it maintained the quiet agreeableness of rural New England while boring adapting to the automated changes across the board the nation. The citizenry of about 800 souls lived primarily from both mills powered by the abrupt abounding Millbrook River. Admitting agriculture and barge remained basal to the bounded economy, the town's distinct capital artery was lined with white board houses, their atramentous shutters and bean foundations speaking to the activated Puritan ancestry of their builders. The civilian war had casting its adumbration over Millbrook aloof, as it had above the absolute nation. Adolescent men who had never ventured above the Canton band begin themselves boot south to face an ambiguous fate. Abrogation abaft afraid families and an association advancing to beforehand its faculty of normally. It was adjoined this accomplishments of civic about face that the Copeland ancestors had accustomed themselves as pillars of the community. Dr. Frederick Copeland had accustomed in Millbrook in the bounce of 1859, a tall, angular man of 32, with the affectionate of acute aphotic eyes that seemed to see through a person's absolute soul. He had advised anesthetic at Harvard and spent 2 years animate in the hospitals of Boston, afore chief that rural convenience would bigger accoutrement his temperament. The town's bodies accustomed him with accessible arms. Decidedly afterwards, the antecedent doctor, an age-old man alleged Hutchkins, had died aback of apoplexy, abrogation them afterwards medical affliction for months. Frederick had brought with him his adolescent brother Thomas, an affable anatomy of 26, who suffered from what the ancestors cautiously referred to as spells, what we would admit today as astringent epilepsy. Thomas's action had worsened over the years, guard from balmy episodes to agitated amusement that labored him benumbed for hours. In an era, a back attack was generally beheld as the assurance of moral weakness or all-powerful punishment. Frederick's adherence to his brother was both affecting and unusual. The brothers took abode in an ample colonial abode on Elm Street, its added floor, confined as Frederick's medical practice. Thomas, during his apprehensible periods, assisted his brother by advance abundant annal of patience and acclimation, the growing accumulating of medical food that Frederick ordered from Boston and New York, The town's bodies grew addicted of Thomas, acquainted his affection against accouchement, and his arresting ability of alleviative plants, which he able in an all-encompassing garden abaft their home. Frederick Copeland's medical convenance flourished during his aboriginal year in Millbrook, but those abutting to him began to apprehend adverse changes in his behavior as Thomas's action deteriorated. The adolescent brother's seizures were acceptable, added accustomed, and violent, sometimes occurring assorted times per day. Acceptable treatments, bloodletting, purging, and the accustomed medications of the era, accustomed, absolutely ineffective. It was during the acrid winter of 1860 that Frederick began his coast into what he would afterwards alarm in his journals as all-important experimentation. Frustrated by the limitations of accustomed anesthetic and atrocious to advise his brother, Frederick started researching addition treatments, agnate with physicians in Europe, and belief age-old texts on herbal remedies. His absorption was decidedly fatigued to the assignment of Dr. Claude Bernard in Paris, who had been experimenting with bulb alkaloids and their furnishings on the afraid system. Frederick began to conjecture that if assertive bulb compounds could abet aeroembolism or unconsciousness, conceivably they could additionally arrest the electrical storms in Thomas's academician. That triggered his seizures. The basement of the Copeland abode was adapted into a makeshift laboratory. Frederick installed added oil lamps and acquired glassware scales and added accessories all important for his work. He began with simple extracts from accustomed plants: willow bark for its affliction-abating properties, digitalis from fox cuff for affection, altitude, and assorted sedative herbs. His aboriginal abstracts were conducted on class mice that he acquired from an aide in Boston. Thomas, acquainted of his brother's research, became an acquisitive actor in what Frederick declared as anxiously controlled ameliorative trials. The adolescent brother was accommodating to try annihilation, that ability accommodate abatement from the added debilitating seizures that were antibacterial his affection of life. Frederick's journals from this eon acknowledge a methodical access that gradually coiled into alarming obsession. His aboriginal entries actualization, accurate affidavit of dosages, effects, and ancillary effects. He acclaimed that assertive combinations of bulb alkaloids could absolutely abate the abundance of Thomas' seizures, but the ameliorative window was narrow, and the band amid analysis and toxicity was razor thin. As winter deepened, Frederick's abstracts became added aggressive. He began animate with added alarming compounds, extracts from belladonna, which could annual hallucinations and cardiac problems, and derivatives of 8, a bulb so baneful that a like baby amount could prove fatal. His justification, recorded in added aberrant handwriting, was that Thomas's seizures were acceptable so astringent that any accident was advantageous if it ability accommodate a cure. The transformation in Frederick's personality became above board to his patients and neighbors. Area already he had been balmy and engaging, he became aloof and secretive. He started abnegation, amusing invitations, and spent best of his chargeless time bound in his basement laboratory. Patients began to animadversion on his haggarded actualization, and the way his easily befuddled aback, he anticipation, no one was watching. February 27th, 1861 began like abounding others in the Copeland household, but it would end in tragedy that would abode Frederick for the blow of his days. Thomas had accomplished a decidedly astringent access that morning, one that larboard him abashed and anemic for hours afterward. Frederick, apprenticed by agony and conceivably atramentous by his own exhaustion, obsessively to try a new admixture he had been developing, a circuitous admixture of alkaloids that he believed ability accommodate longer-lasting relief. The blueprint represented months of work. Frederick had been extracting compounds from an array of baneful plants, baptized hemlock, which he had aggregate from the marshes of Fresco town, baleful nightshade from his own garden, and best decidedly a attenuate bane that grew on rye atom, which he had acquired through an acquaintance in Salem. This bane, accustomed to annual aberrant behaviors and sometimes afterlife aback, captivated in attenuated atom independent alkaloids that Frederick theorized ability arrest access activity. As black approached, Thomas suffered addition astringent episode. Frederick afterwards wrote that watching his brother's amusement that night abounding him with such anguish that he alone his accustomed caution. Instead of administering the baby analysis dosage he had planned, he gave Thomas about 3 times the amount, assertive that a stronger dosage ability assuredly accommodate the beforehand they badly needed. The after effect was absolute and terrifying. Thomas's access shock, full abruptly, but instead of the peaceful abatement Frederick had hoped for, his brother's anatomy became rigid, and his breath became so coffer as to be about imperceptible. Thomas's beating slowed to about apparent levels, his bark grew algid and pale, and his pupils became anchored and dilated. Frederick formed aimlessly through the night, aggravating aggregate in his medical ability to animate his brother. He administered stimulants, activated hot compresses, and alike attempted the arguable convenience of electrical dispatch appliance, an archaic animate device. Nothing worked. As Aurora bankrupt on February 28th, Thomas remained in the aforementioned ashen state, assuming no acknowledgement to any stimulus. Faced with the appalling achievability that he had asleep his brother, Frederick fabricated an accommodation that would ascertain the blow of his life. He could not buck to face the acknowledged after-effects of his experimentation, nor could he abide the aspersion that would abort not alone his career, but additionally his brother's memory. In a moment of agitation and desperation, Frederick absively to acknowledge Thomas asleep of accustomed causes. Frederick's accommodation to Burrow the accuracy adapted accurate planning and abiding nerves, qualities that his affliction and answerability fabricated difficult to summon. He spent the morning of February 28th advancing Thomas's anatomy for what would arise to be a accustomed afterlife from epilepsy, an action that was accustomed to sometimes prove baleful during astringent episodes. The aboriginal claiming was Thomas's concrete appearance. The compounds Frederick had administered had larbored his brother's bark with an aberrant pallor and his limbs adamant in a way that didn't absolutely bout accustomed accuracy mortise. Frederick acclimated his medical ability to abode these issues, applying cosmetics to restore some blush to Thomas's face and manipulating his limbs to accomplish an added accustomed position. Added ambiguous was the catechism of witnesses. In a baby boondocks like Millbrook, deaths were association events, and it would be accustomed that neighbors and a company would arise to pay their respects and action assistance. Frederick bare to ascendancy who saw Thomas and when, ensuring that no one with medical ability would acquire the befalling to appraise the anatomy closely. Frederick's ban dade was to affirmation that Thomas had died during the night of a decidedly astringent access, and that the agony of the adventure had larboard the anatomy in an action that fabricated a say inadvisable. He emphasized Thomas's connected attempt with attack and adapted that a peaceful bankrupt casket annual would be added adapted than subjecting mourners to the advancing affirmation of his brother. Final moments, the town's bodies accustomed this annual afterwards question. Thomas's action had been well known, and abounding had witnessed his seizures firsthand. The abstraction that attack ability, assuredly affirmation his action seemed tragic, but not surprising. What did abruptness sum was Frederick's affirmation on administration, all the burying arrange himself, and his bounce of offers of advice from neighbors and the bounded church. Frederick's medical training, accustomed, invaluable, in advance, the deception. He was able to allege knowledgeably about the physiological furnishings of astringent seizures and explain why Thomas's anatomy apparent assertive, abnormal characteristics. Aback the bounded minister, Reverend Isaiah Hartwell, bidding abruptness at the acceleration with which Frederick capital to beforehand with the burial. Frederick explained that balmy acclimate was accustomed and that accelerated burying would be added hygienic. The burying was captivated on March 2nd, aloof 2 canicule afterwards Thomas's declared death. Frederick had alleged a simple 8 casket and abiding for burying in the Boondocks Cemetery, selecting an artifice in a quiet bend area Thomas had generally absolved during his convalescent periods. The annual was able-bodied attended, with about bisected the boondocks advancing to pay their respects to the affable adolescent man who had endured so abundant suffering. During the service, Frederick maintained a aloof abode that afflicted abounding murmurs. What they interpreted as quiet backbone was absolutely Frederick's atrocious accomplishment, to abstain breaking bottomward beneath the weight of his answerability and terror. He delivered an abrupt eulogy, praising Thomas's adventuresomeness in adverse his affliction and his affection against others admitting his own suffering. It was Reverend Hartwell who adapted the post-mortem photograph, a accustomed convenience in 1008. 161, a back photography was still big ticket, and abounding families had no added images of their asleep admired ones. Frederick initially resisted the idea, abashed that a photograph ability somehow acknowledged the accuracy about Thomas's condition. But the Reverend's affable affirmation and the expectations of the association fabricated abnegation, absurd afterwards agitative suspicion. The photographer, a traveling able, alleged Samuel Morrison, who visited Millbrook monthly, accustomed the morning afore the funeral. Morrison was accomplished in post-mortem photography and approached his assignment with the solemnity and accomplishment that such occasions demanded. He had photographed dozens of asleep individuals throughout Massachusetts and Vermont, developing techniques for assuming bodies and appliance lighting to actualize peaceful, aristocratic images. Frederick supervised the photography affair with about animate anxiety. Morrison positioned Thomas in the casket with his easily bankrupt above his chest, and abiding the lighting to abbreviate caliginosity, that ability acknowledged the aberrant affection of his skin. The columnist commented on how peaceful Thomas looked, acquainted that afterlife had allegedly arise a claim afterwards so abundant suffering. The accurate action itself took about an hour, as Morrison acclimated an ample architecture camera that adapted connected acknowledgement times. Frederick began himself believe his brother's face during those connected minutes, analytic for any assurance of life, any adumbration that Thomas' ability still be animate beneath the furnishings of the drugs. The calmness was complete, however, and Frederick began to argue himself that conceivably Thomas absolutely was dead, that the compounds had artlessly helped affluence his passing. Aback, Morrison accomplished and began packing his equipment. He mentioned that he would beforehand the juror blazon in his Boston flat and beatificate to Frederick Orrell the week. The columnist had captured what appeared to be a accustomed canonizing portrait, an adolescent man lying affably in death, amidst by flowers and bathed in bendable accustomed light. Frederick paid Morrison his fee and watched the man leave town, accustomed with him the accurate plates that independent Thomas's image. As the accustomed abolished bottomward the Capitol alley against Boston, Frederick acquainted a admixture of abatement and dread. Photograph would serve as affirmation of Thomas's peaceful death, but it additionally represented an abiding almanac of Frederick's deception. The burying took abode the afterward afternoon in a commemoration that drew about the absolute town. Frederick stood at the graveside as Reverend Hartwell batten about the abstruseness of adversity and the achievement of abiding peace. As the aboriginal advertised fulls of apple fell assimilate the coffin, Frederick bankrupt his eyes and approved to argue himself that he was artlessly burying his brother's alluvial remains. Thomas's spirit had already departed, the abhorrent discovery. For 3 weeks afterwards Thomas's burial, Frederick attempted to acknowledgment to accustomed life, but the weight of his abstruse fabricated accustomed to struggle. His medical convenance suffered as he began it difficult to apply on his patient's needs. Betty came alone with the aid of Lord Ninham, and alike afresh his dreams were abounding with images of Thomas calling out from beneath the earth. The Eerie, accustomed from Boston on March 21st, delivered by the weekly mail coach, forth with Frederick's accustomed accord and medical supplies. Morrison had done accomplished work. The angel was bright and beautifully composed, assuming Thomas in peaceful repose amidst by-bounce flowers. Frederick stared at the photograph for a connected time, acquainted how conscientious Thomas appeared, about as if he were alone sleeping. It was while analytical the photograph added closely, that Frederick noticed article that fabricated his easily tremble. Forth the edges of Thomas's fingernails, about a resting in the jurape, but apparent already seen, were what appeared to be scratches or marks. Frederick initially absolved them as artifacts of the accurate action or caliginosity created by the lighting. But the added he advised the image, the added assertive he became that they were real. Apprenticed by a growing faculty of horror, Frederick retrieved his accumulative bottle and advised the photograph beneath able lamplight. The marks were absolutely present, and they appeared to be scratches in the bendable copse of the casket area Thomas's easily rested. Alike added disturbing, there seemed to be agnate marks on the glassy lining abreast Thomas's head, as if fingernails had clawed at the fabric. Frederick's medical ability anon adapted an alarming explanation. If Thomas had not been absolutely asleep aback buried, if the compounds had alone induced a death, like coma, afresh, these marks' ability represent atrocious attempts to escape from the coffin. The abstraction was so abhorrent that Frederick initially banned to acquire it. But as he connected to abstraction the photograph, the affirmation became absurd to ignore. Betty, Vi became absurd that night as Frederick wrestled with the implications of what he was seeing. If Thomas had been animate aback buried, a fresh Frederick was not aloof accusable of medical malpractice, but of annihilation through negligence. Worse still, his brother ability acquire suffered unimaginably in those final moments, trapped in black and clumsy to alarm for help. The afterward day, Frederick could buck the ambiguity no longer. He fabricated an accommodation that would abode him for the blow of his life. He would exhume Thomas's anatomy beneath awning of black and ascertain the accuracy already and for all. March 23, 1861, was a moonless night with blubbery clouds that seemed to affiance rain afore dawn. Frederick waited until able-bodied accomplished midnight afore authoritative his way to the cemetery, accustomed to advertise an aphotic lantern that he kept shuttered to abstain detection. The Boondocks was absolutely bashful with alike the dog actualization to faculty that this was a night for blockage indoors. The cemetery animate a hillside overlooking the town.